And I laughed because it's true. I am tired of living through history. I'm tired of living through history. I would rather history happen in a history book where I can read it from an emotional distance. But I'm rather tired of living through history. I remember vividly the Y2K book, because my dad was a computer programmer, so that was a thing in our household. He was gone for a year. And we all say like it wasn't a big deal because nothing happened, but we forget that people worked for a year to make sure nothing happened. I was in college when 9/11 happened. I woke up, one of my friends had stayed over in the night, and I woke up in my room, turned the TV on, and I remember thinking it was a movie. I very much remember thinking it was a movie, like Die Hard was one or something. And it took so I left. I went to class and went to the student union, and everybody was standing in the student union staring at screens. It was history happening. Remember the Wall Street crash of 2008. I remember all kinds of things. And I'm a little tired of history happening. I think we could take a break from history happening. When we went and visited my grandparents, my grandfather and grandmother on my dad's side were born in, my grandmother was born in 1922, and scandalously, my grandfather was born in 1923, so she was the older of the two. She was 4'11", and he was 6'4". Yeah. They lived through the Great Depression. And we used to go and visit. I mean, they lived through the Great Depression as like old enough to know what was happening, right? As a child, you don't really understand what's going on. When you're older, teenagers, adults, you understand a little bit better like the impact of things. So they lived through the Great Depression in Colorado where the Dust Bowl was happening. My grandfather was drafted into the Navy at 6'4", which is kind of funny. They put him on a boat and sent him to Indonesia, where his boat was hit by a torpedo and sunk. I used to sit in their house and listen to my grandmother tell stories about the history that she lived through. Because if you think about the life of somebody born in 1922, there's quite a lot of history that has happened for them. But they had become stories. And I think there's a difference between hearing a story and living through the story itself. What my grandparents had was a distrust of human nature. They did not trust people to do the right thing. They had seen too much stuff. They had been through too many things. And in our culture today, we are told that people are essentially good. That people in their hearts are essentially good people. They're trying their best, they're doing the right thing. But if you have lived through history as I have, I wonder if that is not as true as we like to think it is. I went to a conference. It was a conference of youth leaders and children's ministers, and it was 2 weeks after the Sandy Hook massacre. And so you are in a room full of people who care for and minister to children. The keynote speaker was supposed to be talking about bringing spirituality to youth ministry. How can we create a richer, deeper spiritual environment? But of course, he couldn't help but talk about what happened. And he stood up. His name was Roger. He's a lovely guy. He's one of my favorite people in the world. He got up and he looked at the room and he said, "I know what you're all thinking." He said, "I know what you're all thinking." He said that, how could this happen? How could this happen? How could someone be this way? How could someone do that? And we all sort of nodded our head and said, yes, I can't believe that someone would do something so crazy as this. And then he looked at us and said, "You are Presbyterian," which did not clue me into anything at first. I was like, yes, thank you. We're at a Presbyterian conference, of course, yes. He said, "You are Presbyterian. Presbyterians are not surprised." Presbyterians are not surprised when this happens. We are saddened. We are grieved. We are not surprised. Scripture shows us from beginning to end that there is a rottenness at the core. That all of us are imbued with the weight of sin. And we do from time to time think that we justify it to ourselves in thinking that we're not as bad as other people, right? Well, I'm not as sinful as that guy. That guy cut somebody off in traffic. He is obviously the worst. I'm not as sinful as other people who do terrible things. We get confused between the idea of sin as an action. And sin is just part of who we are. Sin is not the things that we do. In this passage, the writer tells us that the priest used to go into the Holy of Holies to offer sacrifices on behalf of folks who didn't know they had sinned. They were called sins of omission. Yeah, sins of... Good Catholic girl, yes. The Catholics call them sins of omission. They're things that we do that we don't intend to do. They're not purposeful sins. It's not like you went out and robbed a bank. These are the sins that are in our hearts. And the priest went and offered sacrifices on other people's behalves because other people were not so good at recognizing that they needed to be forgiven in the first place. Sin is not the things that we do. Sin is the part of our heart that gives us the impulse to put ourselves first. In our culture, sin often looks like a desire for comfort, a desire for an easy life, a desire to do things the way we'd like to do them. Thank you very much. Sin is the parts of our hearts that are critical of other people. It's the parts of our hearts that maybe choose to go the easy route rather than the correct route. It's the parts of our hearts that shut people out, that divide us from other people. It's the parts of our heart that create tribes and then throw rocks at the other one as if our tribe is pure, but their tribe is evil. The truth is, all of us carry that around in our hearts. There is a system at General Assembly to make sure that everybody who wants to speak gets a chance to speak. You put in your computer, you say, I have something to say about this motion, and you get up and you walk to a microphone and you wait patiently for the moderator to call upon you. So they'll say, James, go to mic number 3. And so you go over to mic number 3 and you wait in a line of other folks who want to speak on the motion. And the moderators of this assembly get to see who you are, where you're from, and details about your life. And their goal is to try to make sure that every voice has an opportunity to be heard. And so I didn't, I listened mostly and prayed a lot, but I got up. There was one thing I wanted to speak on because our committee had spent a lot of time talking about it. And I don't know if you've ever been in a committee that spent a lot of time talking about it, and then you took it to a larger group and the other group took it apart. Has that ever happened to you? Well, this was happening to our work that we had done. And so I got up because I was enraged. I wanted to speak. I felt like I had something to say. And I got up. And I was standing at the microphone. It was me and this other guy. And we were standing at the microphone. And other people kept getting called. And as other people kept getting called, I got more and more enraged in my heart. I have something to say. Can't you see? I have something important. Everybody has to hear what I need to say. But they didn't. That was my ego. That was my sinful heart who distrusted the work of the Holy Spirit. It was my need to feel heard. My anger and frustration was about me. It wasn't about what was happening on the floor. It wasn't about what we were talking about. There was nothing that I had to say that was different than what anybody else had shared. That was about me. And for most of it, that's where sin lies, is our focus on ourselves, on putting ourselves first. And if we're honest, all of us have that inside of our hearts. The writer of Hebrews is drawing on an ancient tradition that we maybe don't understand, but there was this idea in Greek mythology that there was a separation between earth and heaven, that everything that happened on earth was a shadow version of what happened in heaven. So there is a chair, this lovely chair. They believed that there was a perfect version of this chair in heaven, and that all chairs were versions of, or shadows of that object. Does that make sense? So everything in heaven had a perfect version, and everything on earth was a shadow of that perfect thing. Including people. Including us. That all of us, all created people, were shadows of the perfect version of people that existed in heaven. And they believed for a long time that you could not separate the two things, that you could not bring together the two things. There was always going to be a shadow world, and then when you got to heaven, you got to get the cool part, the cool thing, the great thing that worked. That was amazing and wonderful. But that there would always be an imperfect version of it on this earth. What makes the Jesus event so important is that Jesus brought that perfect version to earth and made it possible. That we didn't have to live in a world full of darkness and shadows anymore. That we were not condemned to live in the covenant that was bound and restricted by laws, by the shadow of what could be seen, by the darkness in which we live, by the sin in our hearts, by the brokenness of humanity. Jesus made it possible for that not to be the world we live in. Martin Luther King said, has a great quote that goes, you cannot answer hate with hate. You cannot answer hate with hate or violence with violence. You can only answer hate with love. You cannot drive out the darkness with more darkness. Only light can drive out the darkness. And that is the miracle of the Jesus event. That is the miracle of what Jesus has done for us. Jesus has made it possible for there to be light in the midst of darkness. In the midst of grief, in the midst of pain, in the midst of fear, in the midst of suffering, God has made it possible for there to be something better. Something other, something different, something more. And we have a choice about how we do that, about how we live into that. Jesus came and made it possible for light to overcome the darkness. Jesus came and made it possible for us to overcome our impulse, our sin hearts. Jesus made it possible for there to be something better and something different. And we have a choice about how we respond. Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and be little shadow versions of me. Go and do what I did. Go and be like me, and when you do, you will be bringing light into the darkness. Jesus did not accept a world and a religion and a faith that was bound to its chair. Jesus' commandment was to go and to feed, to go and do, to go and be the light. Go and make the choices that bring hope. While we are sinful and broken creatures, we do have agency over the choices that we make. We do have agency over the words that we choose to use and who we decide to be in the world. We will sin. We will have those sinful impulses. We will have those moments where our ego is more important, where whatever our comfort, our anger, whatever it is more important to us. But we have a choice about how we can respond and what we can do. And so what we need to ask ourselves is, in the coming days, are we making it better? Are we making choices that will bring light, or are we furthering the darkness? Are we making it worse? Are we afraid? Are we choosing the easier path because we don't want to make people upset? We have the choice and the agency. And we can choose to respond to fear with more fear, and violence with more violence, and anger with more anger. But God has told us that there is something better. There's something more than that. Go and do likewise.